Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, I'm hitting it right now, and then I'll give you a thumbs up when we're going.
Awesome.
Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to this evening's event. We are
Megan,
coming
I'm
to
not
you
showing it
from
streaming.
Bright Fam.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm not seeing
not
it
streaming.
streaming. No. Oh, here we go.
Let me.
It's working.
We are on.
We are now. Okay. Welcome everybody. Welcome to the Bright Family Engagement Parent Learning Series. We're really glad that you're all here. My name is Megan Harding, and I am a member of Bright's Family Engagement team. Welcome to our speaker series. We call this Parents Learning with Parents. For those unfamiliar with Bright, we are transforming the way schools support students who are experiencing a mental health crisis. We are a network across the country that's doing this work together. Part of that work is to support parents and caregivers on their journeys of supporting their kids through this time. We do this in a couple of ways. One way is through this free monthly speaker series on a variety of topics that are key areas of interest for families. And we also offer some free weekly support groups that Victor will be mentioning at the end of our session tonight. So tonight's event will be focused on parenting while grieving, helping yourself and your child cope with grief and the grieving process. We're very lucky. This will be presented by Dr. Jessica Griffin this evening. We're very lucky to have her here. And before I pass it to my colleague Sue, who will introduce Dr. Griffin, I'd like to quickly introduce your family engagement team. So I mentioned my name's Megan Harding, and I want to introduce Victor Bradley right here and Sue Donofrio. That is our team. So Sue, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Megan. So welcome, everyone. We know that if you're joining us for this topic, that you're someone who's been impacted by grief and loss in some way. So we recognize that one of the most challenging circumstances as a parent is to support your child's grief while going through your own grieving process. We hope to provide a space to consider and discuss all the complexities of that and some strategies to help you and your child. And we hope that you take care of yourself during this talk. This talk will be here on YouTube and then will live here on the same link. So again, we're so pleased to have nationally renowned expert Dr. Griffin with us tonight. And I will give you a brief bio about her. Dr. Jessica Griffin is a clinical and forensic psychologist specializing in childhood trauma, resilience, and relationships. Dr. Griffin is a nationally recognized expert in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, TFCBT, trauma, resilience, and relationships. She developed the UMass Child Trauma Training Center, now known as Lifeline for Kids, which has trained over 100,000 professionals in trauma, trauma-informed care, and trauma-sensitive practices. She is a highly sought-after public speaker and go-to expert for national media and is a regular contributor to news outlets. Dr. Griffin is also a co-author of a book by the American Academy of Pediatrics, Childhood Trauma, Resilience, and Practical Guide, a go-to resource on childhood trauma for pediatrics. Recently, Dr. Griffin also authored a book for couples, Relationship RX, Prescriptions for Lasting Love and Deeper Connections. Dr. Griffin, thank you so much for being here. I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sue, and to all of you for attending tonight. I wish you could tell my kids that bio. And I do a lot professionally, but the most important job I have is a mom of 3 kids myself. And this particular talk actually started, and Sue knows this, when we had lost a child in our local school system here, and parents were struggling on how do I talk to my kids about traumatic grief, and when there's a sudden unexpected loss, how do we talk about that? Whether it's a peer in school or a sibling or parent who dies, whether it's due to, we've had a lot of death related to COVID-19, for example. There's just been more death that kids are exposed to. But in addition to that, when kids are experiencing traumatic grief, and I'll talk about what traumatic grief looks like compared to grief, sort of typical grieving process. And as Sue so eloquently put, it earlier, making sure that you're taking care of yourselves during this topic. You're probably drawn here because you've experienced some loss yourselves and your own family, or your kids have been exposed to that. And so do what you need to do to take care of yourselves. I'm happy to answer any and all questions. And if I don't have the answer, which sometimes I don't, I'll at least know where to look for that, or be able to reach back out to people with some more answers or guidance. So here's what I'm going to try to talk about this evening, talking about the difference between grief and traumatic grief. What are some strategies you can use to help yourselves and help your kids address grief, and how to talk to kids about death. You know, when we become parents, they don't give you a manual on here's how you talk about really hard stuff. And sometimes we just freeze and we don't know the words to say. And so I'm going to try to give you some words to say, and or show you some resources, or tell you some resources you can use to help you have those words. And then how to, if you are going to a wake or funeral services, how to sort of prepare your children for that. I first want to talk about this concept of stress and toxic stress. And so there are different types of stress that we go through in life. There's positive stress, and I want to be thinking about loss as a type of stressor that we might go through. There's positive stress, and that would be things like you've got the big game coming up, you've got to get ready for, child's got a test they have to study for, and stressing them out. But what that does is that stress response in the body is activated. So you have those brief increases in your heart rate, the stress hormones are mildly elevated. And what that does is it helps activate our bodies to perform, right? So a little bit of the positive stress is actually a good thing. The next set of stressors, so a little bit of stress is a good thing. It helps us perform, it helps us to focus and attend to the task at hand, but then it goes away, right? The stress elevations are mild, and then they go away. Next up is tolerable stress. And this is where there's a serious stressor that's occurred. It could be the death of a grandparent or something like that, a car accident, a serious stressor that happens to the child or to the adult. But what we know about stress and the research on stress and trauma is that if you have the presence of supportive relationships, it's those relationships that can buffer the impact of that stress and prevent it from becoming toxic. And when you hear about the term toxic stress, what that means is that body's alarm system, right? Those stress hormones, those stress chemicals, that body's alarm system stays activated. And the body stays in this sort of heightened state of hyperarousal in the body. That fight, flight, freeze response you may have heard of before, it stays activated. So that stress response system, the alarm system, is turned on, and you don't have those protective relationships to buffer the impact of that stress. And that's where we see that stressor becoming really toxic to the child's overall well-being. So down to their physiology, you'll hear me talk about symptoms, but kids will have compromised immune functioning, impact on their cognition or their thinking, being able to attend to things in school. And so toxic stress occurs when there's this absence of protective relationships. So that's the critical factor. And that's really one of the take-home messages I want folks to understand, is that we can go through really stressful stuff. We can do hard things. We do it a lot better when we have people who have our back. And for kids, the most common is having somebody in a caregiver role. So having a parent or a foster parent, an auntie, someone who's in a caregiving role who says, I've got you, I've got your back, we're going to get through this together. Even if that parent doesn't get it right all the time, and you don't have to, you can be struggling yourself too. But if kids get the message at the end of the day that you've got their back, that you get them, and that you're going to be there at their side while you go through this hard thing, they're going to do a lot better. And that stress response won't become toxic to them long term. So I wanted to just start with that. And, just by being here, being open to hearing, about different ways to support your kids, you're already, ahead of the game when it comes to parenting. And again, even that tolerable stress is buffered by supportive relationships. So I want to make the distinction between grief and traumatic grief. When we talk about grief, and many of you may be familiar with sort of the stages of grief, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's work on the different stages of grief that we may go through, it's just denial, anger, and bargaining. there are these stages of grief, but I want to make the distinction between grief and traumatic grief. And I'm going to focus more today on traumatic grief because this is an area that I think is harder for parents to sort of navigate with children. And this is where children have lost someone in a way that is very sudden, unexpected, or violent, very unpredictable loss. Right. So, for example, the young boy who died at our local school suddenly, a child whose parent dies of an overdose, sudden, a sibling may die in some sort of violent way. Again, that would be traumatic grief when it's sudden, unexpected. It could be violent, and what happens is kids get stuck on the traumatic aspects of how that person died. They get stuck on the traumatic aspects of the death. So they're not able to move through sort of the natural grieving processes that kids will go through or adults will go through. And they may have scary, upsetting memories, negative feelings related to how the person died. For example, I worked with a little boy in therapy who was 4. He and his mom were in a car accident together, and mom was killed. And every time I would meet with him, he would go straight to the Matchbox cars and pull them out, and he would just start crashing them, and he'd drive them in circles, but they would crash, and sometimes he'd bring an ambulance in. But it's his little brain's way of trying to make a different ending and to process what happened to him. But every time that little boy would think about mom, or someone would mention mom, or have a look at a picture of mom, he would have flashbacks related to the car accident and the very painful images that he remembers of what he saw and the sounds and all those pieces. And so we had to do a lot of the trauma work about that particular incident and the death before we could help move him through the grieving process. So traumatic grief is where kids get stuck in the traumatic aspects of how that person died. They may have in addition to scary thoughts and upsetting memories, they may have uncomfortable physical symptoms, and a lot of avoidance. So they avoid things that remind them of the person who died, avoid going to places that might remind them of the person who died, or things that might trigger upsetting thoughts or memories. And so those reactions, the fear of stirring it up in them, makes it harder for them to remember positive things and to talk about that person and what that person meant to them, which is part of that grieving process, being able to recall positive memories of that person. All right, so that was a distinction between grief and traumatic grief. I'm going to talk just in general about how kids respond to grief and loss. And the take-home message here is that they can respond in lots of different ways, and there's no sort of right way to grieve. You may have 3 kids in one family who are grieving very differently. One child may want to talk about it. Another one is avoiding other family members, withdrawing to their room, keeping to themselves and really avoiding. Another child may be acting out at school or having periods where they're laughing and having fun, but then really sad. And so there are different ways in which kids can respond. And again, there's no right or wrong way to grieve. For school-age children, they may understand the physical reality of death, but they may have times that they imagine seeing that person again, but they might not tell anybody. They may still expect to see them again, at home or at school. But kids of all ages will experience grief after there's been a death of a family member or friend or other important person. And that range of emotion can appear, sad. They talk about missing the person. Other times they can go back to their usual activities and play with their friends. And so as parents, you may be like, well, what's he doing? He seems fine. He's playing soccer. He's cool. And then the next minute when he's home, he's having a hard time going to bed. Or there's these behavioral changes, less interested in activities they used to enjoy. They're more irritable. You might notice changes in sleep or eating. Sleep is a really big one that comes up when kids have experienced grief or stress. I'm going to talk about sleep a little bit later and sort of how to manage that, because if kids aren't sleeping, as you know, as parents, when your kids aren't sleeping, they're maybe more dysregulated, and also parents aren't sleeping too. So the whole family's got disrupted a bit. And so sleep is one of the more common things that we'll see for kids who've experienced a significant stressor like a loss. So I'll talk about some strategies to address that. But when kids are adjusting to the loss, we want them to be able to participate in certain tasks that are necessary to the grieving process. So understanding that that person can't come back, being able to cope with the big feelings they have about that person and the death, adjusting to life without that person in their life anymore, being able to talk about memories of that person and what they meant to them, committing to relationships with new people without feeling guilty that, there are other people in my life who I'm becoming friends with, or I see in a caregiving role, and not feeling guilty about that. And then continuing on in a typical sort of healthy developmental path. When kids are stuck in grief and traumatic grief, they're unable to move through some of those steps or tasks that we would want them to do. I get the question a lot, when my kid's crying 1 minute, they're laughing the next. Is that normal? Yes. Moving in and out of grief is normal. Thinking about grief is not this linear process, but more about you're in an ocean, right? And you're riding the waves. And sometimes it's really calm. And then there are times where those waves are huge and they're crashing. And for parents too, you may feel like that wave is crashing on top of you and you're not going to come out of it. Eventually, the water settles, but it's not this steady linear process. So trying to make some adjustments. They don't expect that, you're going to see this improvement that just ticks up like this over time. It's going to go like this. It will improve for sure, but it won't be necessarily a linear process. So what are some signs of traumatic grief? And, these signs also line up with, if you're familiar with, post-traumatic stress disorder, that type of thing, similar kinds of sets of symptoms, but you're looking for things like intrusive reactions. What I mean by that is thoughts that are getting in the way, images, nightmares, memories that are really disturbing to the child, or play about the frightening way the person died. So basically the thoughts, the memories, images, nightmares are intruding on that child's experience. They may have physical or psychological distress. We see a lot of physical symptoms in kids, headaches, tummy aches, maybe frequent flyers to the school nurse. They may have symptoms that might imitate the way that the person died. So if they died of, choking, kids may become preoccupied with that. That's pretty typical response. Or when, we had the boy die in our school, kids were worried about, and his heart had stopped working. They started worrying about their own bodies, and were they healthy, and would something happen to them? That's very, very natural for children to sort of focus on what does that mean if it'll happen to me? So you'll see increase in physical symptoms, again, sleep problems, jumpiness, things like that in children. Avoidance reactions, again, avoiding things that remind them of the person or the way that person died. They might act as if they're not bothered at all. I'm fine, I'm good, no problem. Or avoid reminders of the way the person died, whether it's a car accident, maybe they don't want to go get in a car. If something happened at school, we do see an increase in school avoidance for children who've experienced loss. Even if the loss didn't occur in the school, sometimes we'll see more school avoidance just because of their own anxiety or worry that they might get upset and not have, people that they can talk to in the school. Negative mood or beliefs related to the traumatic death, that's pretty typical too. So feeling lots of different feelings: anger, guilt, shame, self-blame, mistrust, feeling that the world is not safe, or having these sort of altered worldviews. And then, as I mentioned earlier, increased arousal. What I mean by that is that body's alarm system is activated, so that hyperarousal that we see, those stress chemicals, cortisol, adrenaline, et cetera, are released in the body, and their little brains and bodies are bathed in that. And so we'll see, if it's not turned off, that alarm system's not turned off, we'll see more irritability, anger problems, acting out, difficulty concentrating. It'll impact their academic performance oftentimes. And or for older youth, engaging in substance misuse or other kinds of perhaps self-harming behaviors or destructive behaviors to try to bring that hyperarousal down or have an outlet for that. All right, so those are some things to be looking out for. But what do you do? How do you help kids talk about it? And that, I think, is the take-home message, is opening up the space in the home or in whatever setting you're in to be able to encourage children to talk about it. That's okay to talk about grief. And by the way, it's okay for adults to do that too. And so having people in your own life that are your people you can go to talk to, whether that be, a trusted friend, a pastor in your church, whether it be a therapist or other people that you feel comfortable talking about some of the hard stuff. Doing the same thing for children. So how do we get at what kids are thinking and feeling? Sometimes just being closer physically, like sitting next to each other on the couch or putting your arm around them, depending on sort of the age of your child and your sort of family's beliefs about closeness. Some families are closer than others physically, but physical closeness can actually be calming for children. It releases oxytocin in their brains and body and has a calming response, which can actually help to increase the connection between the two of you. So just by, sitting next to each other on the couch or putting your arm around them or giving a hug or offering that comfort and reassurance can help kids feel more comfortable and then help them be able to talk about it. You could look through, let's say it was a parent who died or a close family member, you could pull out photographs, albums, scroll through the photos on your phone, look at those pictures together, talking about special memories you had about the person who died. There are lots of books around grief that I'll share you a list of some of those. But ultimately making sure that you're acknowledging and normalizing whatever kids are feeling. That, you know what, honey, it sounds like you're feeling pretty angry. Do I have that right? Or it sounds like you're feeling scared that this might happen to you. Do I have that right? Naming that, and you know what, that's totally normal and that's okay. And some of the books and other materials can reinforce that reaction that they have. We want to normalize the reaction that children are having, that there's nothing wrong with them, or kids who don't feel anything and feel guilty that I know I should be crying, but I'm not. I know I'm supposed to be sad, but I don't know how to access that. That's okay. Emotional numbness is also a feeling or experience that happens too, and it's okay. And so just normalizing that so they don't think there's something wrong with them, because there's not. And then, incorporating whatever cultural, religious beliefs that may be valuable to your family. Different cultural groups experience grief and celebrate life in different ways. And so being, open to incorporating however your family and cultural group expresses grief, whether that's in the form of certain sort of religious practices or holidays, for example, like the Day of the Dead, depending on sort of what groups you belong to, feeling free to incorporate that and talk to kids about, this is how we celebrate. This is how our family's faith tradition celebrates life. So what we think about death, what we think about the afterlife, that kind of thing. I'll talk more about this with younger children, but in particular, but knowing that you may have to repeat yourself, and this, your parents, so when the kids are young and they start to get to that age where they start asking a lot of questions, like 50 to 100 questions a day, and they're asking the same question and you're having to give the same answers over and over. It's going to be the same thing when it comes to talking about death. So talking about it over and over, be patient with that. That's their sort of brain's way of processing what's happened and processing tough stuff, and making yourself available to listen to them. It is okay if you don't have all the answers. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes the only answer we can say is, I don't know. That's a really good question. Let's put our heads together and think about some answers to that. You know what? Dad doesn't have the answers right now, but I'm going to go talk to some people who might, and I'm going to get back to you on that. And at the end of the day, if you don't have all the answers, it's okay to not to do that. Kids need parents to work with them to try to figure out, puzzle with them about those kinds of things. All right, and talking with kids about death, just some sort of rules of thumb about this. Being honest is really important part of the conversation, is making sure that you are honest and as straightforward as you can be about the way in which the person died. Sometimes you have to be pretty concrete. What you don't want to do, and we've seen this come up in different ways, is tell the child that they died in a way that's very different than how they actually died. You don't have to get into the nitty-gritty. I'll give you an example. I've worked with a family where the father died of what was probably most likely an intentional overdose. There was some suicidality already, et cetera, et cetera. But the child was told that dad died from laughing too much. And the family was trying to protect this little boy from this really tough thing that had happened. And so that's what they came up with at the time. And it was the best they could at the time. But the problem was that he ended up being very fearful of having any sort of emotional expression. So he was afraid to even smile. And dad was like a jokey guy. He had struggled with some mental health stuff, but when he was good, he was good. And that was sort of his banter with his kid. They joked around a lot. And so I think that's why the family was trying to do that, but it ended up causing a lot more problems for the child. So when we're giving explanations of how the person died, we want to be honest, but also keep it simple. So, for example, for the child who died that I referenced earlier, Tyler, Tyler's heart stopped beating. He doesn't breathe in and out anymore. He doesn't need to eat or go to the bathroom. He can't see, he can't hear, he can't feel pain. So being dead's not the same as sleeping. When you're sleeping, all your body parts work. But when a person dies, the body parts stop working. Their body stops working. And that part of him that was alive is gone now. So being very concrete, and it sounds kind of intense when I say it like that, but kids need to know that concrete stuff, especially younger kids need to know some of that concrete. I had one boy who his dad committed suicide, and he was very focused on his father was buried in a casket, and he was very focused on this casket, and he kept like asking me these. He's like, but what's up with this casket? I don't understand and I said, do you have a question about that? Is there something you want to ask? And he's like, well, I don't know how dad's going to be able to go to the bathroom. And so those are the kinds of things that kids will come up with, and they'll fill in the blanks if we don't give them the right information. So telling them that their body, the human body, their body has stopped working. It doesn't work anymore. His body parts don't work anymore. And so when the person dies, their body stops working. And so you may have to say that in different ways. Older youth, you don't have to have those conversations, but for parents of younger kids, to keep that in mind. Keeping it simple, you can always go back and answer more questions as they have them. You want to find out what they already know. They may, especially if something happened like in the school or in the family, and the family has been talking a lot, ask them what do you know? What do you already know? What do you want to know about? And correcting any inaccuracies that you may hear from them. So I'll give you some more examples of sort of how we might keep this simple, using direct language. So using the word dead, they're dead. You don't want to say they're asleep right now, or that they're lost right now, or they passed away. Kids may not understand what that means. We may get that as grown-ups, but children have a harder time knowing what that means. So you could say something like, Dad died today. His body stopped working. He can't breathe. He can't eat. He can't feel hunger or cold. We can't see him anymore or touch him anymore. Again, young kids need those simple, repeated explanations, and don't be afraid to repeat the same thing over and over. Repetition will help kids to understand it better and help it to sink in. So plan for your own mental health that you'll be having probably many talks about death and rituals and feelings. Again, if you don't know the answer to a question, it is okay to say, I don't know. So you want to answer those questions honestly, and making sure you're opening up the dialogue. It seems like, I know you miss Dad a lot. What do you miss the most about him? Asking questions like that. Not being afraid to show emotion yourself. If you grieve openly, it gives your kids permission that it's okay to grieve too. We want to protect our kids from so much, and if we could bubble wrap them in life, I think many of us would. And there are things that we can't rescue them from, and one of those things is the hurt and those painful emotions. And if we could take it away from them, you all know that we could. Not talking about it openly will shut kids down and will not allow them to be able to sort of work through that grief, and or allow them to be able to talk about thoughts that they may have related to the death, like they caused the death in some way, or guilt they have for being mad at that person the last time they saw them. So making sure that we're bringing it up, that we're talking about it. It's normal for kids to think that they somehow caused the death. So making sure that we're alleviating, that guilt. You didn't cause, you did not make dad die. You can't bring him back alive. There's nothing that you can do to do that. They may have fears that other family members will die around them, or other kids, and you just say a simple response to that. Most people live a long and healthy life. Most people do live a long and healthy life, and I expect, if they're worried about you dying, I expect that I will be around for a very long time. And then reassurance, and I'll talk about what reassurance can look like, but that there are lots of people who love you. I love you, Auntie Lisa loves you. Listing out different people who care for that child. And again, giving them the information will help to alleviate anxiety that kids have. I know I said a lot there. I'll try to sort of break down a bit more about what I've been talking about here, but I think there's some good books on loss and grief that you can certainly consider. And I'll see if I can get these slides. I'll check in with Sue later about getting slides out to folks, so you don't have to write all of this down, at least to have the resources. But there's some really great books on here: When Dinosaurs Die, Badger's Parting Gifts, The Invisible String. Those first set of books are more for, I would say, younger kids and school-age children. And then some of the later ones are related to, are more appropriate for adolescents. So Healing Your Grieving Heart, Straight Talk About Death, Grief Day by Day, and When a Friend Dies. So I wanted to include some resources for younger kids as well as older youth. And I don't know if I have in here, if you have very young children, meaning like preschool age range, Sesame Street has some wonderful materials. Specifically, they're focused on all different types of trauma, but if you go to sesamestreetincommunities.org, sesamestreetincommunities.org, they have a whole section, go to the section for parents, specific to grief and traumatic grief. So there are videos that you can watch with your child with a different, not Muppets, whatever the Sesame Street characters are, like Elmo, etc. But where they've experienced grief, and they talk about that, and they really normalize all the different reactions that kids may have. And there's videos you could watch with your child. There's worksheets and coloring books and different ways to do that for parents who may have younger kids at home. So if you need to prepare kids for wake or service, so let's say the death was very recent, and there's a wake or funeral or memorial service coming up, you want to give, again, that concrete, practical information, answer questions that they may have. It's helpful if you can know ahead of time what to expect. If it's going to be an open casket, for example, then you can prepare yourself. But you can also figure out how to talk to your child about that. And so it can be helpful to talk about the purpose of the events, why we do that. We're bringing together friends and family as a way to kind of like a reunion, but it's to really, say, thank you, I love you to that person, say goodbye to the special person who's died, and to really celebrate their life of the person who died. And so it's also a way in which we can get comfort from other people who care about that person, and maybe even share stories and about that person's life. So you'll want to know information related to who's going to be there, what's going to happen there. You're probably going to see a lot of people that are upset, and they may be crying or hugging each other. And again, the knowledge is power for all of us, but for children, it can sometimes decrease their anxiety if they know this stuff ahead of time. Where's it going to happen? When will it happen? And again, back to the purpose of that. Why are we doing this? We're trying to, bring people together to say goodbye to this person, to celebrate their life. Most of the time, we suggest that kids get the opportunity to attend funerals or wake or whatever memorial service there may be, as a way to help them have that particular closure, say their goodbyes, and move forward. There are times in which kids are not going to want to do that. And this is a little tricky. there's some language we can use with kids around that. Of course, I understand why you might not want to attend. It sounds like it might be scary or really sad. Asking, tell me what about this is hard for you, so you can get a sense of what their concerns might be. And you might say something like, families who love together also are going to grieve together, and it's important for me, it's important to our family that you come. It's important to have you there. We're all family. This is a family event. And then, it's really important that for me also to have you there and for you to be able to say your goodbye there. But if they absolutely refuse to go, don't force the issue. At the end of the day, it's ultimately not worth that, and the stressor on both of you or your family, and if they're vehemently refusing to go, don't force it. Instead, make sure they're not made to feel guilty for not wanting to attend. Perhaps they're, one of the things that's happened with the pandemic is a lot of our services have been like live streamed, or there's recordings that have been made of those, if that's possible, being able to have that accessible later to do, and watch together, or if there's photographs of the services or the event, being able to share those with them. Writing down who was there, what happened, who said what. So when they are ready, you can let them know that you're available to talk about it whenever they're ready to do that. But what if, as a parent, you're the one who doesn't want to go? And again, avoidance is a very powerful thing. We want to avoid doing things that we know are going to be painful. And so it's understandable that you may want to avoid it altogether, may want to avoid seeing the person who died, what happened. You may be afraid at how you might feel, that you might fall apart in front of other people. One thing that might be helpful in that instance is thinking about that funeral or memorial service as an opportunity to remember that person, to celebrate their life rather than their death. And making sure that you also have your own people that can be there with you if you feel like, what if I'm too upset to be there for my kids? Having sort of a buddy system, a code word, whether it's a close friend of yours or another family member or other support that you can have be there with you if you need to sort of tap out and take care of yourself, to then be able to take care of your kids. So even if it's just for 5 minutes where you need to just get it together, that's great. Have a buddy system, or maybe more than one buddy if you need it. But counting on the relationships we have. When I talked about toxic stress earlier, those protective relationships, same principle applies when it comes to adults. We need people too, and so having your own support system that can be there for you in this, particularly if there's a funeral and such, having them there that can be there in some sort of supportive capacity. All right, so if kids aren't sleeping, as I mentioned earlier, this is pretty typical when there's a significant stressor that's happening. And the reason for that, I'm not a neurologist, I won't get into this very deep, but there's an area of the brain called the reticular activating system. And it's responsible for sleep and wakefulness cycles in our brains and for regulating that. And the other thing, though, that it's also responsible for, is activated in, is the stress response in the body, that fight, flight, freeze response in the body. And so when there's a stressor, it's hijacked and it is in survival mode and it takes over. And one of the things that's first to go is sleep. The wakefulness, sleep cycles and patterns are affected. So, and you all know that when you're stressed out about something, you're waking up at 3 a.m., right? Does that happen to anybody else besides me? So for kids, for adults, when that reticular activating system is activated, or when there's stress, it's really hijacked. And so we see sleep as one of the more common symptoms. So I'm going to get into some strategies on what can you do about it. And I'll talk about sort of bedtime to address some of the sleep stuff. But I want to talk about one strategy you can use, we call the 3 R's, which are reassurance, routines, and regulation. And I'll talk specifically about what I mean about each of those. The first one, though, is reassurance. At the end of the day, no matter what the stressor is, if it's trauma, traumatic grief, kids need to know that they are safe, that they are loved, and that the grownups are doing everything that they can to make sure that they're safe or loved. There's pictures of kids at bedtime. One of the best ways you can start doing that, especially if sleep is an issue, is doing a lot of reassurance at bedtime. Having this a bedtime routine, which I'll get into, having some sort of ritual during bedtime for kids, where you start thinking about that bedtime earlier in the day. So not just 5 minutes before it's time for bed, but maybe an hour before. We're sort of dimming the lights, and we have a routine that we follow. And then when they're going to sleep, letting them know, how much they're loved, that they're cared for. For kids who have a hard time separating at night, you may have they're wanting to be closer to their parents after a stressful event, needing to sleep in the parents' room. That will happen. It's very natural. Sometimes it can be helpful to have some sort of shared lovey or shared object or post-it note for older kids. I'm thinking of you, I've got your back, I love you. Something that they can see that's tangible, a shirt that smells like dad or mom or caregiver that they can have at bedtime that can help. So the reassurance can really help for children to calm that body's alarm system. And a good way to start doing that is at night, using transitional objects and other things. When we get to thinking about reassurance about death, again, opening up that conversation, correcting inaccuracies that kids may have, being honest in your responses, limiting social media, especially, this is more common in older kids, school-age kids too, but limiting social media, and or if it's an event that's in the news, limiting that as well. So for yourselves, it can be really tempting to want to read as much as you can about a particular situation, but staying away from that. When we found, when there's been different deaths in school systems, for example, the social media, it flies. It's like wildfire, and the inaccuracies that kids have, or hypotheses they're coming up with, are hard to sort of control. So we may need to think about limiting the media in that way. And then we'll focus on routine and regulation, those second R's that I mentioned earlier. And so routines, back to bedtime here. When you are engaging in a routine, what that does is it sends signals to the child's brain that they're safe. That predictability sends those safety signals to their brain. So they're able to calm down. So they're able to, that reticular activating system in their brain will help them be able to sleep better. So you could start with, if they don't have a bedtime routine, you could start with that. And this would be obviously one for younger kids. Older kids too, though, may need to have some type of bedtime routine that isn't just turn off your Xbox and go to bed. It may need to be a little more sort of stepwise than that. That also involves some opportunity to connect, like, hey, let's talk 5 minutes about your day. What do you have going on tomorrow? They jump in the shower, you give them a hug goodnight, I love you, and there's your bedtime routine. Here's one, for example, for younger kids. But routine sends signals to the child's brain that they're safe. Kindergartners, teachers do this so well. You walk in a classroom, you see, we know what we're doing every 15 minutes. I'm not saying parents should do that, but some sort of predictable sort of patterns for, evening, for morning before school. Routine communicates safety, which may be, which ultimately is the underlying goal for kids. And then regulation. I'm going to talk about regulation in a couple of ways. And what we're talking about is regulating their feelings and behaviors. One way in which we can start to regulate through our relationships with our kids is this concept of mentalizing, or holding the mind in mind. That sounds a little woo-woo. What I mean by it is the idea that even when we're not together, we're still connected. Even when you're at school, I'm still thinking of you. I've got your mind in my mind. So even when we're not together, we're still connected. And so there are different ways you can do that. The book, The Invisible String, that I showed earlier, is a wonderful way to talk about this concept, using, post-it notes that, I'm thinking of you, I've got your back. I'm so proud of you, buddy. You know, having Post-it notes in their lunchbox or places that they may see it will help to increase that connection. So I mentioned the idea of a shared lovey, where you've got your stuffed bunny, I've got my stuffed bunny, and I'm thinking of you even when we're not together, using Post-it notes or other things. They sound simple, but they actually go a really long way with children as a way to increase that connection they have to us and as their sort of safe base. And then another way we're addressing regulation is helping kids deal with big feelings. This idea that you may see, you know, they're mad at the world, you know, they're having outbursts at home, flipping over the table, or you know, having outbursts that are not necessarily helpful. And so we're seeing anger at the surface, but just knowing that what we're seeing at the top, most likely there's a lot more behind that. Anger is a much easier emotion for many children to show than shame or guilt or fear, rejection. And so keep in mind that even if you're seeing anger, there's probably more beneath the surface, and to just keep that in mind. It's a default. It's really a default for kids, and they may not understand what underlies that emotion. And so kids need ways to help to understand the complexity of their feelings and other ways to express it. As parents, we're an emotional container for our kids. And so we need to be able to help them tolerate strong emotions, and knowing that it's not necessarily about us. They may act out with us, but it's not necessarily about us. We have to be able to sort of hold those big feelings without us taking those feelings on ourselves. And a way we can do that is to respond calmly to kids and help name those feelings. And we can do that by modeling our own feelings. Yeah, mommy's feeling really sad today. I'm feeling, you know, really sad about, you know, grandma not being here anymore, and naming the feelings. And then, you know, so kids don't learn how to regulate right away. So they need support to learn how to do it. It's okay if they don't get it right right away. We're helping them do this by naming emotions, by letting them know it's okay to have lots of different feelings. And we're helping to also regulate them by what's called co-regulation. And these are just big words for I'm trying to manage my own emotions so I can help you manage yours. So mom and dad, we've got to take care of ourselves so we can help you take care of yourself. And so when they're seeing you take care of yourself, you're also able to take care of them. That can help to improve regulation. And lastly, we're getting into how we might calm the body down. There are lots of relaxation strategies for children that you may be familiar with already. There's lots of different strategies that are out there, such as belly breathing. Sesame Street's got some great stuff on belly breathing, and this lists of all different kinds of calm down strategies for children. It doesn't have to be deep breathing or yoga. It could be other things. It could be dancing. It could be listening to music. You know, just getting outside and going for a hike. So lots of different ways in which we can help kids to calm down. It doesn't have to be this elaborate, you know, 30-minute meditation that we're doing. It could just be, you know, 5 minutes that we're coloring. It could be, you know, listening to music, doing what we call progressive muscle relaxation, where you just progressively squeeze the muscles. So regulation comes from calming that stress response. And it doesn't have to be complicated. There are things you can do in, you know, less than a minute. And we love to use apps to help us with teaching some of these strategies. I won't list all of these, but there's some really great apps that are available for kids and teens as well. And then I want to just talk very briefly about one strategy you can use to talk with kids. If you feel like you don't have all the answers or you don't know what to say, there's this concept they teach us in How to Be a Therapist 101 school, where it's called reflective listening. And the idea is that I don't have to solve the problem immediately. The idea is that the person on the receiving end feels like you get me, you understand me, that you have my back. And so we don't have to solve every problem. Sometimes it's just more about, it's more about kids feeling heard and understood. And so what you might do is, let's say, you know, my child gets off the bus, they come home and they say, you know, Billy was mean to me on the bus today. And this is like the fourth time Billy's been mean to him on the bus. So instead of me being like, I'm calling the school, or I'm calling Billy's mom, or I'm going to go talk to Billy, we want to stop. I might stop what I'm doing, put my phone down, stop cooking dinner, say, get down on their eye level, or say, you know what, this sounds really important. Let's go sit at the dining room table in 2 minutes. I'm going to pay attention, right? I want to give them that eye contact. Instead of calling Billy's mama, I am remaining neutral. Even if it's hard for me to do, I'm going to try to do that. And continuing to actively listen. So hearing what they have to say. You said Billy was mean to you on the bus. I'm saying it back to them. I'm rephrasing them. You said Billy was mean to you on the bus. And that sounds like it was kind of embarrassing or maybe upsetting for you. Do I have that right? So asking kids if they have that right. So you can use the therapist trick. What I hear you saying is, Billy was mean to you on the bus today, and it sounds like that made you feel really frustrated and mad and maybe even a little embarrassed. Do I have that right? Continuing to listen, and then why don't we put our heads together to solve that particular problem? So reflective listening is a strategy you can use to talk with kids about grief. If they're coming in and really having some big feelings about that, let's talk about it. Tell me what's going on. Listening to them, rephrasing it back. It sounds like you're really missing your dad. And it sounds like you're feeling really sad and maybe even a little confused. Do I have that right? Let's keep talking about it. So again, reflective listening. If the child is experiencing a lot of symptoms, they're needing assistance, you're feeling like you're needing a referral to treatment, you can contact our referral system we have at UMass at Lifeline for Kids. It's called Link Kid. We're statewide, where we facilitate referrals to evidence-based treatment for trauma and traumatic grief. You can call our 800 number there. For us to take a referral. Our goal is to really cut down on wait times for kids who have experienced trauma and try to increase their access to services. Lastly, some resources we have, and there is a video specifically on grief that we developed. I will try to put the link in the chat later if that's even a thing I can do. But it's called Paradox. It's kind of a cheesy name, but it's myself, a psychologist, and then my dear friend and colleague, Heather Forkey, who some of you may know, who's a pediatrician. And we talk about sort of the medical perspective and mental health perspective on lots of different topics related to kids, from sleep to grief to anxiety, managing behavior, all sorts of things. And they're just quick sort of 5-minute videos for parents specifically. So feel free to check those out. And here is my contact information. If you need to reach me, email's the best way. And then we can open it up for questions. I do have, though, Sue, are you all doing a survey? I have my evaluation team did a brief sort of parent survey. I don't know if you guys do that, but I have a QR code for that.
Okay, we can drop that. Excuse me. We can drop that in the, if you put that in the chat, I'll transfer it over to the YouTube link.
I will do that. So
Thanks,
here
Jessica.
on the screen, I'll stop my share and then I'll put it in the chat. Is that right?
Thanks, Jessica. Okay. That's great. And I know we only have a few minutes left. I know Victor has a question from a parent. And then I know we have a couple others. So do you want to hop in with that, Victor?
Sure.
And that was fantastic, Jessica.
Yeah,
thank you.
I just want to, before we start the question, thank you so much. That was incredible, so helpful, so mindful. How even the slides were so welcoming on a really, really difficult topic to address. And I learned so much. I'm an early child educator, and a lot of times these things aren't geared towards young children at all. And this was for everyone. So I want to appreciate you for that. And just your tone, maybe you want to listen and maybe you want to just gather more information. So thank you. Before we begin questions, I just wanted to say that to you.
Thanks.
It was great.
Thanks so much.
So our first question that I have here is from someone, and it says, my teenage son's friend recently just took his own life. I feel like I have no idea how to help him navigate with him.
Yeah, and this is such a difficult topic when there's suicide and teen suicide, and this is one where you do the best you can, right? And you may not have all the answers, and I'll tell you, the professionals don't even have all the answers. There's a good resource it's on the National Child Traumatic Stress Network site. I'll see if I can multitask and pull it up, that has materials related to suicide, for example. But a lot of the things I talked about today, just opening up the space to have your child talk to you about how hard this is or what questions that they have, just by having that support and having the space to talk about it is the first step. Depending on how they're reacting or responding, they're going to be moving through that grief process and moving through the traumatic grief, having a lot of questions about how this happened. One of the things that we see pretty typical is kids having that underlying thought that I should have known this was going to happen. There's something I could have done to prevent this. That is so normal. And part of what the work that we do therapeutically is helping them understand that, suicide is something that it was that person's choice to do. There's not something you could have done that would have stopped it. What about the other adults who were involved in their life? They didn't know either. And so starting to address what we call maladaptive cognitions, but thoughts that are not helpful or are inaccurate. And that's really common when there's been a suicide. There's something that I could have done to have stopped it. And so it depends on the specifics. If they're really struggling, I would suggest, making a referral if you can, to a therapist who's trained in trauma. And we're happy to help facilitate that.
Thank you.
Dr. Griffin, one of the other things that, we wanted to kind of spend a little bit more time thinking about, when we were putting together this speaker series was, this information about how to help your child is so important. And like Victor said, it's really geared towards younger children and really breaks it down in a loving and sort of natural way. We know that when a parent is significantly grieving, that can be really hard to do those things. Do you have any strategies for the parents who may be going through their own really significant grief, who might not be able to access? I know you talked about a village, and if you could just say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and so if parents are struggling themselves, if you're going through grief yourself, doing, first you got to put your own oxygen mask on before you can be effective to or be there for your kids in whatever form that looks like. Seeking professional help, of course, I'm a clinician, I'm going to say, like, go and access that, but there's other ways to get support too. Maybe it's through, your faith community. Maybe it's, reaching out to other people, even people who maybe you haven't talked with lately, but people who've been trusted people in your own life, to try to, even as hard as it is, you want to sort of crawl up into your own cave, connecting with other people or asking them to check on you, and then giving yourself a lot of grace that it's okay to not get it right. It's okay for kids to see you grieving. That's okay thing. If you're not able to keep it together, you're not able to effectively parent, and you're really struggling and the depression is just completely taken over, looking for professional support and or other people who can sort of help you in an interim way, and with the caregiving, the parenting aspects, looking for support groups, grief support groups in your community can also be useful. To hear from other people. There are groups for parents who've lost children. I do a talk at UMass every so often for a group. It's a group of parents who've lost kids. Kids have died at UMass, and but it's a very special group of people who understand and get each other. And so it depends on the type of death. You might want to look for a support group for people who've maybe lost a spouse or lost a child, or if siblings died or something. So that can also help to not feel as alone, especially if you have lost a spouse and somebody says, well, I lost so and so, but it's not the same thing. You may feel less alone in that way, but it's okay to not have it together, but not being afraid to seek services for yourself.
Yeah, thank you. And we're getting feedback from the parent who asked that question that was helpful to hear. And another parent's also commented the grief support services offered by Samaritans could be helpful.
That's great. Yeah, whatever's available in your community, and I know every community's got different sort of groups that are there and are available. And I don't know, Sue, I did put a resource in the chat around talking to your kids specifically about suicide. It's a guide for parents on that. So if that's helpful for the person who asked earlier about that.
Thank you.
Sure.
And I think we probably have time for just one more question. I know we're getting close to the hour. Just thinking about what my kids go through that's unique if they're grieving the loss of a sibling. If there's anything specific about that.
Yeah. And this one is, oh God, probably the hardest one for parents, to be honest. And having had to witness this sort of pain with families, it's horrific. What we'll see in siblings is sometimes survival guilt, you know, that, well, I'm alive, why didn't I die? And then also very natural responses. There's so much focus on the person who died. What about me? And so that's okay too. And then they may experience guilt about and a lot of self-blame. So again, that self-blame that kids may have, you know, related to there's something I could have done to prevent this. Or, you know, we've had a couple of kids who died in a drowning in a family's pool or at the lake, and the siblings were there. You know, that sort of guilt, there's something I could have done. I could have stopped it. I could have done more in that. And so you will see a lot more of those unhelpful thoughts that kids have, or inaccurate thoughts that kids have. And in those instances, there are very few times where I would say would not suggest seeking professional support for those. It's too much for a parent to try to manage that on their own. If you're grieving a loss of a child and siblings are also struggling. And so that is one where if you're going to put money on, that's where I would say, you know, making sure that you're getting professional support for you and your kids.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you so much. Victor and Megan, I don't know if you want to follow up with any other thoughts or.
Yeah, well, I'll leave it to Victor to wrap up, but I'll just quickly say to all parents watching, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us for this. And Dr. Griffin, just truly, that was amazing. And I put a bunch of things in the chat on the YouTube live. So thank you, Dr. Griffin. I put your resource. I put your survey, and I dropped our flyers for the free weekly support groups. So pass it over to you, Victor.
Thanks so much, Dr. Griffin, for this amazing presentation and resources. And I'm so glad that this has been recorded so people can refer to this as well when they need it. So thank you again. Right now, I want to talk a little bit. We're wrapping up and we're almost done, but I want to share that we do have parent-to-parent support groups that meet weekly. There's a BIPOC group on Monday evenings, and on Tuesdays, there are actually two groups. One is a dad or male caregiver group, which also meets, and then there's also another group for that meets later at night in the evening for people on the West Coast or people on the East Coast who are up late and kids are asleep, so they can join us. And then on Wednesday, we have also a group as well for everyone. So I wanted people to know that information is in the chat. So if you need those flyers, grab them now and get their times and dates and where to, and the Zoom links. So, but I just want to thank you yet again for doing this. This has been incredible. So I think that's it for us tonight.
All right. Thank you all. It's a pleasure.
Yes. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.